Whether you're into unsolved mysteries, solved mysteries, or creating your own mysteries, Amazon Music's got millions of podcast episodes waiting. Just download the Amazon Music app and start listening to your favorite podcasts ad-free, included with Prime.
Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're the place you come to when you want to get past the headlines and really understand the complex stuff, the source material, the reports, the memos, all of it. We break it down so you're truly informed.
And today, we're really digging into something that's caused a huge amount of international concern. We're talking about the U.S. military strikes. These are airstrikes, kinetic attacks, targeting alleged drug smuggling vessels. This started back in September 2025, mainly in the Caribbean, but it spread to the Pacific too.
Yeah, let's just jump right in because the numbers alone are pretty stark. We're looking at what? As of late October 2025, at least 43 people confirmed killed across 10 incidents, and only 2 survivors captured.
That's right. And it's not just the number, it's the precedent. I mean, sources are clear. This is the first time the U.S. has publicly acknowledged carrying out airstrikes in Central or South America since the Panama invasion in 1989. That's a big deal.
A very big deal. The U.S. is using lethal military force in international waters. They're labeling the targets narco-terrorists.
But, local reports often paint a different picture, saying these are poor fishermen, people from coastal villages. It's complex.
And the administration's line is very direct. Very aggressive. They say this is about stopping drugs, specifically fentanyl. They're targeting groups they name, like Venezuela's Tren de Aragua, Colombia's ELN.
Calling them narco-terrorists.
Exactly. The claim is they have to hit these boats to stop the flow.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to really scrutinize those claims against what the sources actually say. We need to focus on what seems to be the core issue here. The almost total lack of public evidence for these claims.
We also need to unpack the legal justification the administration has tried to build, because international legal experts are calling these strikes extrajudicial killings. That's incredibly serious language.
Absolutely. And ultimately, we have to ask, if it's not really about the drugs, given the lack of evidence and the legal problems, what is the real motive here? The sources strongly suggested something else entirely.
Okay, let's start with the timeline, the facts on the water. This wasn't just one random incident, was it? It escalated fast.
No, not random at all. It kicked off September 1st, announced the next day. That very first strike killed 11 people. Then by late October, boom, it expands way out into the eastern Pacific off Colombia and Ecuador.
And this wasn't just Coast Guard cutters. There was a significant military buildup beforehand, right? Mid-August.
Yeah, sources confirm Navy warships, personnel moving into place starting mid-August.
Yeah.
And then the big one, the deployment of the USS Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group.
Wow, a carrier strike group.
Yeah, I mean, just so you understand the scale, that's thousands of sailors and aviators, maybe 6,000 service members, plus all the aircraft, destroyers, cruisers. It's massive power projection.
This isn't your typical drug interdiction. This is, well, it feels like something else.
It is something else.
Mm-hmm.
And the language matched it. The administration wasn't just talking about criminals anymore. They were calling them terrorists.
And the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, he was pretty blunt about it.
Oh, absolutely. He said, quote, instead of interdicting it on the president's orders, we blew it up.
And it'll happen again.
We blew it up. That confirms it right there. It's a shift from law enforcement stopping and seizing to outright military destruction, killing.
And here's the absolute crux of the problem, the thing that comes up in every critical analysis. The evidence gap. It's huge. The administration is asking everyone, including you, to accept this massive military operation, these killings.
Based on what?
Based on their word. They haven't released any verifiable public evidence, none. No proof the boats belonged to the ELN or Tren de Aragua. No proof they were carrying drugs.
But the president kept saying they were loaded with fentanyl. He even put videos online.
Right, he did share those aerial strike videos.
Yeah.
But the fact-checkers and analysts looked closely. The videos show the explosions, yes. They do not show bags of drugs, floating around afterwards.
Which you'd expect, right, if a boat loaded with fentanyl gets blown up.
You'd think so. You'd expect debris, packages, something. The visual evidence just doesn't back up the loaded claim. And the whole fentanyl focus itself seems questionable based on what we know about drug routes.
It really does. I mean, experts are pretty clear. Most fentanyl getting into the U.S. comes overland through Mexico. And it's largely smuggled by U.S. citizens, actually.
Not by sea from Venezuela.
And Venezuela plays a really minor role in the drug flow reaching the U.S. Negligible, some experts say, especially compared to Mexico or Colombia. So focusing lethal military force there specifically citing fentanyl, it just doesn't track with the intelligence picture.
It immediately makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why Venezuela, a known adversary, and not Mexico, the main source? What's the real target here?
Exactly. And then look at the details of that first boat they hit, the San Juan de Unare. The description itself raises more questions.
What was the description?
Okay, so it was described as a flipper-type boat that's a low-profile design, semi-submersible, meant to dodge radar. About 12 meters, maybe 39 feet long, 4 big 200-horsepower engines. Okay, maybe that fits a smuggler profile.
But there's always a but.
The but is the number of people on board. 11. On a boat that small.
That does seem like a lot.
Yeah, experts like Greg Grandin and David Smile jumped on that immediately. They asked, why would a serious drug smuggling operation cram 11 people onto a small boat?
Because usually space is for the cargo, right? Maximize the profit.
Precisely. Every inch, every pound of capacity is for the drugs. You keep the crew minimal. 11 people suggests, well, it suggests something else was going on. Maybe they weren't all essential crew. Maybe they were passengers. It just muddies the picture and contradicts the idea of a lean, professional cartel operation.
And then there's that really critical piece of intel that leaked out.
Ah, yeah. The anonymous national security sources.
What did they say about that first boat, the one where 11 people died?
They acknowledged that the boat appeared to be turning back towards Venezuela when it was hit.
Turning back, so potentially heading away from international waters or any perceived U.S. target.
Exactly. If it's turning back, it's arguably no longer an imminent threat that requires immediate lethal force. It might be fleeing, heading home.
Which means it should have been maybe tracked, intercepted by law enforcement later, not blown up by the military.
That's the implication. If that intelligence is accurate, it completely undermines the administration's justification for that first kinetic strike. It suggests the decision to use lethal force was made even when the supposed threat was diminishing or heading away.
Okay, so the facts on the water are shaky. The evidence is missing. The intel is contradictory. This leads us straight into the legal justification, or maybe the lack thereof. How did the administration try to frame this legally?
Well, this is where they made a really significant and frankly alarming move. They essentially tried to rewrite the legal rule book for this specific situation.
Oh, so?
On October 1st, they formally notified Congress. And get this, they stated the U.S. was now engaged in a non-international armed conflict.
A non-international armed conflict. Okay, what does that mean in practical terms?
It means they're invoking the laws of war, but not against another country.
Against who, then?
Against unlawful combatants. And who do they designate as these unlawful combatants? The drug cartels.
Wait, so they're saying drug traffickers are equivalent to enemy soldiers in a war?
That's precisely the implication. By calling it an armed conflict and labeling them unlawful combatants, they're trying to take this completely outside the realm of criminal law.
Which means no need for warrants, arrests, trials, due process.
That's the goal. In an armed conflict, under the administration's interpretation here, you can lawfully target and kill enemy fighters, even if they aren't posing an immediate, direct threat at that exact moment. You don't need to try and arrest them first.
Just neutralize them, like in a war zone.
Exactly. It's a fundamental shift from treating drug trafficking as a crime to treating it as an act of war, and the traffickers as enemy combatants you can kill on sight.
What was the reaction from, international legal experts?
Immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Experts talking to major outlets like the BBC, UN human rights specialists, they condemned it. They said these strikes violate basic international maritime law, violate human rights law.
What terms did they use?
They used terms like extrajudicial executions. Some called it murder. Because these individuals weren't soldiers in a recognized conflict, and they were killed without any legal process.
Any specific names stand out?
Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell, who's a very respected voice on international law, was quoted saying the strike violated fundamental principles of international law. It wasn't seen as a gray area. It was seen as a clear violation by many in the field.
So the administration basically created its own legal justification to allow these killings.
They tried to create a legal framework where these actions could be seen as lawful by redefining the situation as war. But the international consensus seems to be that the redefinition itself isn't valid under existing law.
What legal authority did they even cite initially? Was it clear?
Not at first, no. It was quite vague. Eventually, they pointed to the president's inherent powers as commander-in-chief under Article 2 of the Constitution.
Okay, the standard fallback.
Right. But they also kept using that term narco-terrorists, and that felt very deliberate.
Why? What's the significance of narco-terrorist?
It sounds like they were trying to subtly link these actions to the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, the AUMF.
The post-9/11 authorization, how does that apply to drug cartels?
Well, legally, it almost certainly doesn't. The AUMF was specifically about the groups involved in the 9/11 attacks. Applying it to drug cartels is a huge stretch, legally speaking. But using the terrorist language seems like an attempt to borrow some of that AUMF's expansive wartime authority.
Critics must have picked up on that.
Oh, absolutely. Former government lawyers, legal scholars called it lawless, dangerous, reckless, because it completely blurs that critical line between crime, which is handled by law enforcement and courts, and war, which involves the military under very different rules.
And this legal unease, it wasn't just outside experts, right? There were issues inside the administration.
Definitely. Sources indicate that lawyers within the Pentagon itself raised serious flags. They were worried about the legal jeopardy for the military personnel actually carrying out these strikes. Could they face charges internationally?
That's significant pushback from within the military's own legal counsel.
It is. And it might explain, or at least contribute to, a pretty dramatic event. The sudden resignation of Admiral Halsey.
The head of U.S. Southern Command, the command actually running these operations.
Exactly. Southcom. His abrupt departure was widely rumored, according to sources, to be directly related to disagreements over the legality of these strikes. An admiral quitting over policy like this, it suggests the internal conflict over the legal basis was really intense, right up to the highest levels of command.
So you have internal dissent, international condemnation, but the administration pushed ahead. Did they seek approval from Congress, like under the War Powers Resolution? I mean, they're calling it a conflict.
No, they explicitly avoided that. The president himself basically said they weren't going to ask Congress for a declaration of war.
What was his quote? Something quite direct.
Very direct. He said, I don't think we're going to necessarily ask for a declaration of war. I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country.
Wow. Just kill people, bypassing Congress entirely.
And when Democrats in the Senate tried to push back, they introduced a War Powers Resolution to try and limit the president's ability to keep doing this without congressional approval.
How did that vote go?
It failed. Narrowly, 51-48, which really shows you the partisan divide on this. Nearly half the Senate wanted to assert congressional authority, but just over half sided with the executive branch's claim of authority.
And was Congress even kept in the loop? Was oversight happening?
Apparently not sufficiently. Senator Mark Warner, who's a senior member of the Intelligence Committee, stated publicly he was not briefed before the first strike happened.
Not briefed. The Intel Committee. That's extraordinary.
It suggests a deliberate effort to avoid scrutiny, even the legally required oversight mechanisms, before launching these lethal operations.
Okay, so if the drug rationale is weak, the evidence is missing, and the legal basis is highly contested, even internally, it forces the question, what is the real motive here? Why take all this heat?
And this is where the sources really start pointing away from counter-narcotics and towards geopolitics and, frankly, domestic political calculations.
How so?
By mid-October, independent analysts, even some Venezuelan opposition figures talking to the media, were saying the U.S. objective had clearly shifted. It wasn't primarily about drugs anymore. It was about regime change in Venezuela, targeting President Nicolas Maduro.
That's a huge shift in stated goals.
It is, and you saw reactions reflecting that. Maduro himself accused the U.S. of plotting regime change, warning his people to prepare to fight invaders.
And on the other side,
you had Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado actually quoted dedicating her Nobel Peace Prize to the U.S. president. That directly links the strikes to the political goal of ousting Maduro, and it plays straight into that very vocal, very influential anti-Maduro constituency, especially in South Florida.
So connecting the dots between the action and a desired political outcome in Venezuela.
Exactly. And sources reveal this wasn't a universally agreed upon strategy within the administration either. There was apparently a real internal fight.
Between who? What were the factions?
Broadly, you had one camp, reportedly led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, pushing for maximum pressure, hardline policies, including supporting regime change. Then there was another group favoring maybe more diplomacy or less direct military action.
And who tipped the balance towards these kinetic strikes?
The sources point strongly towards Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff, and his reported reasoning is really illuminating.
Why did he support the strikes? Was it about Venezuela for him?
Apparently not primarily, no. A source was quoted saying Miller sided with the Rubio camp not because of regime change, but because Venezuela offered an outlet for the belief that the president can just kill these guys.
Kill these guys.
Meaning alleged criminals, drug smugglers. It suggests Miller saw this less as foreign policy towards Venezuela and more as an opportunity to expand presidential power specifically, the power to use the military unilaterally against perceived threats and to militarize domestic issues like the war on drugs or immigration.
So setting a precedent? The president can order killings like this.
That seems to be a key part of the motivation, according to these sources. It fits a pattern, too. Remember those earlier reports about the president asking advisors if they could just conduct military strikes inside Mexico to take out drug labs?
Right, I remember that. So this wasn't totally out of the blue.
No, it suggests a long-held desire to use military force directly against cartels, kind of bypassing international law and sovereignty concerns. Venezuela just became the place where they decided to actually do it.
And the choice of targets reinforces this, doesn't it? Focusing on Venezuela over, say, Colombia.
Absolutely. Colombia is by far the world's largest cocaine producer. Its drugs heavily impact the U.S. Venezuela produces, as sources state, negligible amounts of cocaine comparatively. So if your primary goal is stopping the flow of drugs,
You'd focus on Colombia or Mexico, not Venezuela.
right. Focusing the military firepower on Venezuela strongly suggests the goal is putting pressure on the Maduro regime, not efficiently stopping narcotics.
And look at the diplomatic fallout with Colombia itself.
Huge fallout. Colombian President Gustavo Petro. Remember, Colombia is supposed to be a key U.S. ally in the drug war. He flat out accused the U.S. of murder. He named one victim, Alejandro Carranza, said he was just a lifelong fisherman.
How did the U.S. administration respond to that accusation from an ally?
Not well. The president attacked Petro personally, called him an illegal drug dealer, threatened to cut off U.S. aid to Colombia, imposed tariffs.
Wow. So doubling down on the policy even at the cost of a critical relationship.
Exactly. It shows the priority. Maintaining this aggressive military posture, even if it alienates the very country most crucial to actual counter-narcotics efforts, was deemed more important. The geopolitical objective, whether it's pressuring Maduro or expanding presidential power, clearly trumped the stated drug-fighting objective.
Which brings us back inevitably to the people caught in the middle of this, the human cost.
43 people killed. That number needs repeating. And reports from local media in Venezuela, Colombia, Trinidad, they often identified the victims not as cartel kingpins, but as fishermen, people from poor coastal towns like San Juan de Unar.
We heard about bodies washing ashore in Trinidad.
Yeah, 2 unidentified bodies washed ashore there. Families in Trinidad, families in Colombia, they came forward accusing the U.S. of killing poor people, saying there was no due process, no warning, just lethal force.
It paints a picture far removed from a targeted strike against high-level narco-terrorists.
It really does. And then there's the incredibly revealing incident involving the survivors.
The 2 men captured after that alleged narco-submarine was hit on October 16th.
Exactly. This was a previously unannounced strike that came to light. 2 guys survived, a Colombian and an Ecuadorian, and they were captured by the U.S.
Now, if the administration really believed its own legal argument that these guys were unlawful combatants captured during an armed conflict.
This was their golden opportunity, right? They could have put their legal theory to the test, detain them, maybe try them in military commissions or even federal court, establish that precedent they seem to want.
But they didn't do that.
No, they did the opposite. They very quickly and quietly repatriated them. Sent the Colombian back to Colombia, the Ecuadorian back to Ecuador.
What was the official reason?
Just vague language about it being a very standard way of handling something like this, which is just completely at odds with having labeled them enemy combatants in a war just days before.
Why would they do that? Why give up the chance to prove their legal case?
The interpretation from legal analysts is pretty clear. They likely did it to avoid a legal challenge. They knew if they tried to prosecute these men under the unlawful combatant theory in any real court, military or civilian, the whole legal basis for the entire campaign could collapse under scrutiny.
So better to get rid of the evidence, essentially, the living evidence.
It looks that way. Repatriate the survivors quickly, avoid the courtroom, avoid a potentially devastating legal ruling that could declare the whole operation illegal, keep the legal theory untested, asserted politically, but never validated judicially.
And didn't things get even more awkward with the Ecuadorian survivor?
Oh, yeah. This really undercut the U.S. position. He gets sent back to Ecuador, and what happens? Ecuadorian officials look into his case and promptly release him.
Released him? Why?
Because, according to Ecuadorian officials, they found no evidence he committed a crime in Ecuador.
So the U.S. nearly kills him in international waters, calls him an unlawful combatant, sends him home, and his own country says there's no evidence he did anything wrong there.
Precisely. It makes the initial U.S. justification for the lethal strike look incredibly thin, if not entirely baseless, at least in that specific case. It just highlights the preference for military action over investigation, interdiction, and prosecution.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize all this. What does it all add up to when you put the pieces together?
Well, what emerges from the sources is a picture where the administration seems to be using counter-narcotics as a pretext. The claims are disputed, the evidence is missing or non-existent. The intel even contradicts the narrative sometimes.
And they're using this pretext to justify a military campaign that international law experts widely condemn as illegal, as extrajudicial killing.
Right. And the real drivers seem to be twofold. First, a politically motivated desire to exert pressure on the Maduro regime in Venezuela, possibly aiming for regime change. And second, maybe even more fundamentally, an internal push associated with figures like Stephen Miller to expand executive military power to establish the principle that the president can order the military to kill alleged criminals without trial under this new narco-terrorist or unlawful combatant framework.
And this framework, this legal theory, it's not just about Venezuela anymore, is it?
Not at all. And this is where it gets really concerning looking forward. By declaring cartels unlawful combatants, they've essentially created an open-ended justification for military action.
Which explains the expansion to the Pacific, off Colombia, Ecuador, Peru.
Exactly. That swift expansion shows this isn't geographically limited. It's a legal doctrine they believe they can apply anywhere they designate these groups as operating. It creates a permanent roving authority for lethal strikes.
And the president himself has hinted at what's next.
Yeah, he told reporters quite explicitly, the land is going to be next. He suggested he might go back to Congress later to explain strikes on land, but he insisted he already has the authority.
Already has the authority to conduct military strikes on land against these groups, presumably inside other countries.
That's the implication, based on this same unlawful combatant theory.
So here's the final thought we want to leave you with, something to really mull over after hearing all this.
If the administration has successfully, at least politically, rebranded drug smugglers criminals as unlawful combatants, allowing them to be killed militarily without trial in international waters,
Right.
a designation previously used for groups like al-Qaeda after 9/11.
Then what actual practical limits are left? What stops the executive branch from using this same logic, the same military force, against any other group, domestic or international, that it decides to label a threat?
It raises a profound question about the erosion of legal norms and the potential for the unchecked militarization of problems that were once handled by law enforcement and the courts. Where does this doctrine stop, if anywhere?
When you've got Omaha Steaks' convenient everyday protein waiting at home, that what's for dinner panic turns into your weeknight win. And now's the time to buy during the Omaha Steaks Spring Savings Event. Save big on their exclusive lineup of mouthwatering steaks, gourmet burgers, air-chilled chicken, pork, seafood, and more. Go to omahasteaks.com for an extra $35 off when you use promo code AUDIO at checkout. That's omahasteaks.com, promo code AUDIO. Terms apply. See site for details.